for joining us this beautiful, what is it, April already? Wow, mid-April. Had a great time last week, Easter celebration. Lots of food and fellowship. Took a break from 1 Corinthians, but now we're back at it again. And today we will cover 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 to 27. Take a moment or two to get situated. And just as a refresher, since we did take a break last week, Paul has been deliberating on the topic of freedoms. He started discussing the responsibility that believers in Christ have to help those who are thought of as weaker. In other words, just because I have the freedom to do many things in Christ, it doesn't mean that I have to take advantage of those freedoms, especially if the exercise of those freedoms will hinder the walk of my brother. And after establishing that truth, Paul went ahead and mentioned how he applied that in his life. Namely, the fact that he did not require the Corinthian church to support him financially, and also, very likely, he chose not to marry or remarry if he was initially married and then possibly lost his wife. But he chose not to take on that privilege because he wanted to focus on the ministry of the gospel. And again, he understood that those were sacrifices that were worth taking for the sake of those he was ministering to. And now Paul is continuing in this train of thought, again, thinking about how he was willing and motivated to sacrifice himself and adding things to it, as we will see here in these verses that we will cover. So again, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, from verse 19 to 27. And it says here, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews, and those who are under the law as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law as without law, not being without law towards God, but under law towards Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now, this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be a partaker of it with you. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now, they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore, I run thus, not with uncertainty, thus I fight not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. So we can split this up into two main sections. The first section being verse 19 to verse 23. And here Paul is explaining not only his willingness to sacrifice those freedoms for the sake of his audiences, but he's also mentioning here a sort of flexibility that he exercised as he was sacrificing his rights. He names here different types of groups the Jews, those under the law, those without law, those who were weaker. And basically, the gist of what Paul is trying to say here is that he was somewhat of a chameleon, if you will. There were certain things about his approach to explaining and teaching the gospel and doing things to motivate people to believe in those truths. There are certain things that he changed, adjusted, altered based on who he was ministering to. For those who were under the law, the Jews, he made sure that he incorporated the truth of the gospel within that frame of mind, within that world view. And to those who were not under the law, he did something similar, and again, particular to how they viewed the world, how they interacted with those realities. To those who were weaker, and he's already defined and explained what that means. Basically, it means those who aren't as mature with regards to their belief in God, pertaining to what God accepts or does not accept. And to those, he acted as a weak person as well. But again, this diversity here is within this concept of sacrificing his rights. I'm sure Paul had a preference. Paul, being who he was, a very mature individual, he had a preference pertaining to how he interacted with the truths of the gospel, but he did not live out those preferences and instead chose to adjust his being and his actions based on who he interacted with. Now, it's important to note that even though Paul was somewhat of a chameleon, changing up based on who his audience was, he didn't change everything. Not everything about Paul changed based on who he interacted with. There was something that was unchanging, something that never was altered or adjusted. Basically, his belief and his understanding of the gospel, the fact that he knew what these truths were, that was not changed ever. He did not alter the message. He never took away or added to it. The message stayed the same. So in essence, even though Paul changed quite a bit, there is something about him that never changed, which was the truth of the gospel. Now, many people act like Paul. Wouldn't you agree? Chameleons of sorts. Maybe here at church, you act a certain way. Your vocabulary is adjusted based on the limitations of those who are here. Maybe in your work environment, you act in a different way. Maybe among your peers, your select group of friends, there are certain ways that you are. Maybe to strangers, you're even a different way. So again, the fact that Paul adjusted his demeanor based on his audience, that is not something uncommon. Most of us do that naturally. What is uncommon here, exemplified by Paul's demeanor, is the fact that even though, again, he adjusted, he wasn't seeking acceptance. And that's what's uncommon. Because when we become like a chameleon of sorts, and we adjust ourselves based on our audience, often, very often, we do so because we want to be accepted by all. And then when we do that, very often, what ends up happening is that which we believe, or the focus of the gospel, actually shrinks and diminishes because we don't want to offend anyone. What are they going to think of me? I want to be accepted. I want to be acceptable. So amongst those people, I'll say certain things and I'll act in a certain manner. amongst those other people, I'll adjust that, again, for the purpose of being accepted and acceptable. Well, that is not what Paul did. Paul could care less about how he was accepted or acceptable. His focus and his purpose for adjusting himself, for changing himself, for maybe even altering his demeanor was always because of Christ, the truth of the gospel contained in this message of salvation. That was the purpose. That it wasn't to be liked. It wasn't to be thought of as good or better or whatever else, or however else we can explain that phenomenon. There's an example in Paul's story, not contained here in 1 Corinthians, but in Acts and in Galatians, that kind of touches upon this reality that we're seeing here. Paul had basically two main young disciples, Timothy and Titus. You know, he wrote letters to those individuals. Usually we call those letters the pastoral letters because they were young disciples of Paul, but they were actually in charge with congregations of their own, and Paul wanted to instruct them as to how to lead these people, right? And it's interesting because there are a lot of similarities pertaining to Timothy and Titus and their relationship with their mentor, Paul. But there's one distinct thing that Paul did with these two individuals pertaining to circumcision. In Acts chapter 16, when that subject came up as applied to Timothy, Paul actually encouraged and allowed Timothy to be circumcised. Now, when it came to Titus, in Galatians chapter 2, Paul actually did the opposite. He did not allow Titus to be circumcised, which is kind of counterintuitive, right? Because we're just talking about one particular topic or subject matter, circumcision. And we're talking about two individuals that were, somewhat similar pertaining to their relationship with Paul. So why would Paul act in such a drastic, different manner? It was because of the purpose. With Timothy, by Timothy being circumcised, it actually aided in the process of reaching out to the Jews. Paul understood that was the main focus, saving the Jews. And in that particular place and time, it was beneficial for the message of the gospel to be accepted if Timothy was circumcised, because that was the focus of their ministry in that particular place and time, namely Lystra and Iconium in Acts chapter 16, I believe. However, with Titus, when Paul was dealing with the topic of circumcision, that area that he was writing to and interacting with, the area of Galatia, they were dealing with a particular problem pertaining to legalism. And certain Jews or Christians that were of, a little bit more leaning towards the law, they actually started teaching that believers needed to abide by standards of the law, or else they would not be accepted by God. And because of that, Paul said, nope, you are not going to be circumcised, because if you do, and if you are, then I'm going to be feeding into this wrong notion or these wrong teachings. So again, there is flexibility pertaining to how Paul interacted with people, and even regarding decisions that he made, like the one that I just mentioned. But the focus was always the same. How can I be better equipped? And how can I minister in a more efficient way so that people accept the gospel of Christ, the truth contained in that? What can I do? I will change. I will do whatever it takes. I have my preferences. I have my freedoms. I have my wants. I have my likes. I have my leanings. But regardless of what of that, all of that. What will it take for these people who I'm speaking to right now for them to accept the message of the gospel? So again, Paul was very accommodating, utilizing his freedoms in a very wise manner, but never altering his beliefs, neither his teachings. So there are limits. There were limits to this flexibility that Paul exercised. And now here he is exemplifying that. And the reason why I touched upon this idea of, yes, flexibility is good, but there are limitations. It's because the world that we live in, the society that we live in, more and more is becoming intolerant of these limitations and disagreements. Wouldn't you agree? It is rather funny to think about it, because it seems like society wants to have a sort of non-disagreeable way of interacting with one another, to the point where there is this view and this push to have tolerance at all costs. Right? No disagreements whatsoever. Anything that is remotely disagreeable is thought of as borderline hate speech. I cannot disagree with you. You cannot disagree with me. If I touch upon a subject matter that is kind of taboo, if you think you are right and you live your life in a certain manner, and if I say that I disagree with those choices, it's hate speech. I am practicing intolerance. I am being a bigot of sorts. That is unacceptable. Again, Paul did not view the world in such manner. Yet, that's kind of the trend that we are heading into. The flexibility that Paul exemplified and practiced had nothing to do, again, with being acceptable by all. It had nothing to do with trying not to hurt people's feelings. Paul was very much willing to hurt people's feelings if, in fact, that led them to know the truth about Christ. Yet, again, we live in a society and in a time where that's becoming harder and harder to practice. And it's funny because there's somewhat of a paradox pertaining to how our society wants to promote tolerance at all costs. Because think about this for a second. When a group of people or a society at large wants to promote tolerance at all costs, by definition, they have to be intolerant of things they view as intolerance. Right? If I'm trying to promote tolerance at all costs, basically, nothing that I can say is disagreeable, may hurt people's feelings, may be something that is thought of as counter to what you believe in. If it is tolerance at all costs, then consequently, by definition, I have to be intolerant towards anything that I view as intolerance. Paradox. Crazy. You become that which you disdain. Totally intolerant for any thoughts outside of your own or what you view is the truth. So, limitations. Being willing to be flexible, malleable. Understanding that flexibility, there's a purpose to it. The focus here that Paul is mentioning is the gospel of Christ. If there's anything that can be done for someone to accept that truth without altering that truth, please go right ahead. But there are limits. If there are certain things contained in the gospel of Christ and in your belief in it that may hurt people's feelings, so be it. Because that is the truth that cannot be changed. And now Paul goes on to the second half of this section here. Again, we're just kind of breaking this down into two main sections. He is going to utilize the illustration of an athlete. And here he's just trying to reaffirm the level of commitment that he had towards being a minister of the gospel. How much he sacrificed. How much he worked at it. So he says on verse 24, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. Now, this is another thing that is totally counter to our society. Wouldn't you agree? Some of you already know what I'm talking about. You know what it is, right? The participation trophy. Everybody is a winner. You get a trophy, you get a trophy, you get a trophy. Everybody is in first place. Nobody is in last place. Everybody is included. You are all winners. Consequently, why should I work very hard if right from the start, in the beginning, we are all winners? Fact of the matter is, in professional sports or anything related to it, there is only one winner. And thereafter, you're a loser. You may be the first loser, the second loser, the third loser, but you are a loser. There's only one winner. Only one individual that gets that first place trophy, medal, prize, whatever it may be. Paul understood this premise, this concept, this truth very well. And here he is trying to illustrate the efforts that he put into relaying the message of the gospel, and he did so in a manner that was rather obsessive. He is utilizing the illustration of not just a run-of-the-mill athlete, of a top-notch, world-class athlete that is just obsessed with winning the championship, the trophy, the prize, the record. Because there are a lot of people who call themselves athletes, but they're just kind of there just because they want the paycheck. They might want the fame, the popularity. They may like that particular sport, but there are certain individuals, and we know who those are, very famous people throughout history and current day, that they just obsess about winning. And it's almost like a sickness. And they are so dedicated that they are willing to do that which their peers are not willing to do. They're willing to forego certain privileges, certain freedoms, certain rights, because they obsess with winning that singular prize. So they have no leisure time. They don't eat certain types of food. They don't rest as much as we rest. They don't eat donuts. Maybe they don't interact as much as they should with their loved ones. They practice and dedicate themselves and exercise, not only while they are doing what they do, but days, weeks, months, even sometimes years if we're talking about a competition such as the Olympics or the World Cup, constantly dedicating themselves for that particular goal. And Paul, he is putting himself in the shoes of these types of people. And he's saying, I am obsessed with winning this prize. Now notice, people who are obsessed of this level of competition and wanting to win at all costs, they forego They do not exercise certain privileges and freedoms, but none of those are bad in and of themselves, right? What's wrong with leisure? What's wrong with certain types of food? What's wrong with time off? What's wrong with comfort? Nothing wrong is wrong with that. Paul is just simply saying, look, even though there's nothing particularly wrong with those things, when a world-class athlete, someone who obsesses with winning, when he looks at those things, which inherently they're not evil, they're not bad, they're not sinful, they're not wrong, but they feel that any of those things that they don't actually help him or her achieve their goals, then they put that to the side. And now the parallel or the bridge is obvious. Paul is saying, I am obsessed with winning people over to Christ. And there are certain privileges, certain liberties, certain perks that aren't bad in and of themselves, but if I feel that those things aren't actually enhancing my ability and the opportunities that I have to speak to these people's hearts in an understandable manner, then I'm just not going to take advantage of those things because I want that prize. I want that reward. Paul goes on to mention, and everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. So now he's making another comparison here, and he's saying, look, people in real life, these athletes, they do it for something that will eventually decay. It will fall apart. But we do it for something that will not decay, cannot fall apart. It is everlasting. How much more obsessed should we be? How much more? It is literally something that lasts forever. This reward, this celestial reward, cannot perish, will not go away, will never be taken away. It is yours forever if you so choose to seek it out. Strive for it. Reach out and grab it. He goes on to say, therefore, I run thus, not with uncertainty, thus I fight, not as one who beats the air. What in the world is Paul talking about here? Have you ever beat the air? Yeah, you're just so upset and you just start swinging at the air. Purposeless. No reason for that. You look like a crazy person. Paul didn't do things without a purpose, even if it looked kind of cool, right? Air guitar, shadow boxing, right? He thought that was a waste of time. I do things for a purpose. I don't swing at the air. I don't just, do things for the sake of doing things. Busybodies of sorts. Everything that I do is meticulously thought out because I have this goal in mind. But I discipline my body and bring it to subjection, lest I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. The disqualification that Paul is talking about here is not loss of salvation. It is actually loss of reward. Paul is basically stating here that there is a reward for those who are specially dedicated in sharing the truth of Christ in the good news of the gospel. And he wanted to do his best because he understood that there was a reward, and he did not want to be disqualified from achieving or receiving that reward. So here we have, Paul adding to and continuing to emphasize the fact that he had all these rights, he had all these freedoms, but he chose to utilize them very appropriately and selectively, even to the point where being extra flexible so that people that he interacted with, different people, that they could be reached by this truth. So now the question is obvious, right? Because here we have the example of Paul, and he was obviously following the example of Christ, highly dedicated, much like a world-class athlete, somebody who is obsessed with winning or with their craft. Have you ever met somebody like that, anywhere close to that? You feel so insignificant, right? You feel so lazy, even though you may not be by general standards, by normal ways of viewing the world, but when you interact with these types of people, man, you feel like a bum, like a couch potato. No comparison regarding lifestyle, regarding dedication, regarding how one may utilize their time in the most efficient way. No comparison. So now applying this to the gospel, right? Because here the focus is obviously not just exercise and being good athletes and whatnot, although there's nothing wrong with that. But here again, the truth is regarding sharing the gospel and the fact that Paul was just so dedicated and wanted to have his life be an example to others so that they could follow in his footsteps. So the obvious question is why? Why are we not as dedicated as Paul? Why are we not obsessed with winning people over to Christ? Why aren't we doing this at all costs? Why? And I thought about this, reflecting on my own realities. So these things that I'm going to mention are things that I personally struggle with. So I figure if I struggle with it, maybe you do. I may be wrong, but I'll give it a shot. The one thing that as I analyzed myself and thought about this for a little while, the reason why I am not anywhere near as dedicated as Paul was, it's because often I view my Christian walk, my relationship to Jesus, if I'm still utilizing the athletics illustration, much more as a sprint as opposed to a marathon, right? And I run in spurts, if you will. Highly dedicated, motivated, right in the beginning, or at certain points and periods of time, but it's a marathon. It's a long process. And I get bored every once in a while, or tired, or I listen to that little voice in the back of my head saying, just stop. What are you doing? Why are you doing this? Again, go eat a donut. Go take a break, rest for a second. Bella and I, we started running a few weeks ago. We've done it a few times already. And bear in mind, I haven't ran in like 2 years, right? So we were talking about it, going back and forth. Let's get in shape. Let's start running. And then I said, you know what we should do the first time around? Let's run some hills. Yeah, right? Haven't ran in 2 years. Let's go run some hills. So I go and we start, just stretching and getting all loose up and limber and stuff. And man, let's take on the first hill. If you've ever been to my house, there are, a couple of hills exactly where I live. And we did the first hill. I'm just, going gung-ho, all at it, just having a ball. A third of the way through the second hill, I'm like, man, this is harder than I thought. This is actually very grueling. Maybe I shouldn't have, done that first hill so hard and kind of paced myself a little bit, saved a little bit of energy. Long story short, we walked the rest of the way. Next time around, we figured, okay, let's just run normal, normal streets. Let's forget about the hills for a while. Eventually we'll live up to that, we'll work up to that, but we're not ready for hills. And that's kind of the mentality very often, I believe, in Christianity, in our Christian walk. We wake up one day all motivated, and we say, oh man, I'm going to do all these great things, and we'll go from like 0 to 100, and we just go at it and lose stamina. Get exhausted, and then literally just fall apart and crawl towards the finish line. It is a long process. It is a marathon. We have to be very particular how we live our lives in a manner that is going to not only show efficiency and effort, but also consistency throughout. Not just running in spurts, but consistently being dedicated to that which we believe in, regardless of how high the hill is, or the slope, or whatever it may be. So that's the one thing that I thought I needed to personally work on, and maybe you do as well. The other thing, the second thing, and the last thing, is the fact that I live, and you live in a society that leads me, and maybe you, to forget very easily that the wrath of God is coming. We live in a great place in the world, in a great time in the history of man. Wouldn't you agree? And the gospel message is such that, by definition, it's the good news. And usually, from the purely human perspective, people are much more susceptible to accepting that good news if they're sort of living out and feeling a little bit of the bad news that the world has to offer. Again, they're experiencing this bad news, and you offer them the good news, and it's such a drastic change that it becomes so much more enticing and acceptable, and you hunger for it, and you want it. But again, we are blessed. We are blessed to live in the place that we live and in the time that we live, and often, unfortunately, that blessing actually becomes somewhat of a curse with regards to our understanding that the wrath of God is coming. We forget because of the inherent comfort that we live in. People throughout history, and even current day in other portions of the world, would love to experience our typical bad days. Would love our typical bad days. You know those annoying days, right? You forget your Netflix password. Wrecks your day, wrecks your whole day, right? Because then you have to figure out, the answer to the secret question, and you have no idea what grade school you went to, or your name of your first pet, or your mother's maiden name, you totally forgot, right? Or, that puzzle-looking thing pops up on the screen, and it tells you, click on all the boats. And for the life of you, you can't figure out what the boat is, right? And then you can't move on to the screen that actually recovers or retrieves your password, and it just wrecks your day. And you're like, how was your day, honey? Oh, I spent like 2 hours on this. Horrible. Do you know what many people would say in the world? What? Nobody died in your village today? Pretty good day. You had multiple meals today? I will exchange that for 300 days that I've experienced so far this year. Again, we easily forget because we are just so comfortable. And here I'm not making light of our personal struggles and our personal pains and sufferings. Those are all true. But here we easily forget that the wrath of God is coming. And because of that, this urgency to seek out those who are in need of salvation, it is diminished by this view of the world that is rather too comfortable, quite often. So the encouragement for me, and maybe even for you, is twofold, pertaining to how Paul is exemplifying his lifestyle and how we can mimic it. Pace. Pace. It is a long race. It is a marathon of sorts. Pace yourself. Dedicate yourself in particular ways so that there is consistency in your walk. Not just these peaks and valleys and just running out full speed and then just crawling the next day. And also, regardless of your comfort level, your first world problems, the wrath of God is coming. And there are literally people trucking towards that, full speed ahead. And you're there, and you can do something about it. You can intervene. Do so whenever appropriate, whenever God calls you to do. Dedicate yourself to that purpose, and I will try my best to do the same. Amen.